Thank you for joining me again for another Eco Spirituality session. So the theme of this session is Togetherness, and like always, we'll learn why as we go along. And my name is Michael, and all of you know me though, just in case someone's watching the recording. So, getting into the biology as usual. So, as years go on, we have more and more evidence that plants have very complex forms of communication, which isn't necessarily speech like you or I have, but rather they have abilities to release chemicals that elicit a response in their neighbors. So this can be through the ground, through these fungal networks that connect plants, or through the air by the release of chemicals from their leaves. And this is used for many different reasons. This can communicate the presence of predators, or to gain support when a particular tree is ailing or under stress, or even potentially to coordinate mass years. And I'll also say there's little evidence of plant consciousness. This is something, a bit of a pet peeve of mine sometimes, when people overclaim the scientific consciousness of plants. Spiritually, I will touch people's spiritual relationship with plants, but scientifically, there's no evidence that plants have a conscious thought. And trying to distinguish the two. So that brings us to mass years. So many trees that produce nuts, like oaks or beeches or pecans, will produce a mass on a regular multi-year cycle. I'm sure you've seen this probably at some point in your life, where you'll walk out and all of a sudden there'll be acorns or beech nuts or black walnuts everywhere. And that's what a mass year is. They're just carpeting the forest floor or people's yards. And they do this to overload potential predators. Oh, sorry, I had a brain fart. So the words in the slides, I guess, are not the right words, but we'll continue on, I guess. Sorry about that.
What's it called again? A mass what?
A mast year, so M-A-S-T. And I think it's derived from some kind of Old English word. I'm not exactly sure what the etymology of the word mast year is. But, okay. So, yeah, sorry about the slides. I think the quote should be okay, but if not, maybe I will try to find the correct slideshow. But I thought this was the right one. Anyway, moving along. Trees that produce nuts have a mast year to overload the potential predators of their nuts with food, ensuring that some of their nuts will survive to produce trees in the following year. So the idea behind it is that if they produce hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acorns, the squirrels can't possibly eat all of the acorns that they produce, and so at least 5 or 10 will survive, even though 90 will get eaten. And so, an important part of the mast years is that all of the trees in a grove and in a particular forest will have a mast year at the same time. So not only is one tree producing hundreds of nuts, all of the trees in the forest are producing hundreds of nuts. And how they do this is a mystery to ecologists. Weather certainly plays some role in it, as it is very energetically expensive to produce nuts. And my best conjecture as an informed citizen, I guess, is that they utilize their extensive modes of chemical communication to coordinate this effort. And by taking this deep, extensive communal action, these trees ensure that their survival of their species. And moreover, this pattern can allow other species like humans and rodents to create buffers of these highly nutritious nuts for more leaner times. So, you can store pecans and acorns and whatnot as they are essentially, and use that for a food source. Okay, the titles are correct, but all of the, that's so weird. Like some kind of weird tech in between. So anyway, another aspect of togetherness in the forest is from canopies. So in my wanderings in many a New England woodland, I always find a very suspicious amount of dead trees that look very much dead, but they're still standing and they're still alive. And I wonder why that is. And I later learned that these trees trees are actually being kept alive by trees around them via the transfers of sugar through their root systems that they also use for communication. And these trees will often, so trees in the forest will often support these sick and dying trees, either nursing them entirely back to health after a bad infection or infestation, or keeping them alive just as long as they possibly can. And evidence shows that all trees give into the system and all trees benefit from the system. So even the big, huge, healthy trees at times will take support from the smaller trees around them that have that need. But again, why? This seems very counterintuitive to the survival of a particular tree. And they do this because they are much stronger as a community of trees than any one of them would be alone. And they need every single tree, even the sick and dying trees, to maintain this. But again, how does this community make them strong? Community makes them strong because every tree in a continuous forest, in a continuous plain, helps break the wind. And so if the wind is blowing over the forest and there's a single gap in the top of the forest, the wind can get in and rip branches off or even tear down whole trees because wind is a very powerful force, as we know in Wyoming. And so especially for more fragile deciduous trees, so with the glossy leaves, wind can be a very detrimental force. So having this almost huddle of trees where each one takes a little bit of the brunt, they support each other. And furthermore, the forest ecosystem is actually a very modified ecosystem. So the trees lock in moisture, they regulate temperature, and they regulate light exposure, and that are two perfect conditions for their younger offspring. And so if one of the gaps in the canopy is compromised, this alters the humidity and the light exposure and everything else, and makes an unideal incubator for young trees. And so every tree is important, even if it costs energy to maintain the gaps, or to maintain the lack of gaps in the community. So they survive by togetherness by the social support system. All right, and once again, we come back to mosses because that is my area of expertise. This is one of the last science slides. I'm trying to overload you all on science. So, as I've said in previous sessions, maybe you remember, mosses lack an ability to keep water in their bodies like other plants do because they lack a cuticle, so they lack the waxy surface on their leaves to prevent water from evaporating. And obviously, like all plants, they need water. And so, mosses have many manners of dealing with this, physiological and chemical, and I won't bore you with the biochemical processes that they use to deal with this. But the most fundamental mechanism that they have for maintaining water in their bodies is actually to grow close together. Yeah, so their togetherness allows them to retain water for long periods of time because a mammoth moss isn't one organism, it's many organisms that all grow very, very closely together. And the reason why they do this is because the physical properties of water, sort of like adhesion and cohesion, when you see the drops go together, that's cohesion. And so mosses, did I explain that right? When you see the drops going down the window, and the drops form together into a bigger drop, that's cohesion of water. And that's a physical property of water. And mosses use that, so they grow close together, so that the water will stick together in between their stems, and then they will be able to retain that water for a longer period of time. So by doing this together, they maintain water and it gets trapped between their stems. And that is their most important process for maintaining moisture in their bodies. Okay, so faith. Now we got to the faith part. We made it through the biology, and I hope it wasn't too bad. So, faith and togetherness. So, all of these examples, the oak trees all massed in together, and the trees maintaining their canopy and mosses all growing together, speaks to me as our call as Christians to be in loving community with one another. Communities of faith are much stronger and more robust to me each other and for the world when we coordinate together and grow together. You know, and we are called to support our communities, and I think the Masters of Oaks are almost parable-like in some way. The way that they coordinate with their community to ensure their own wellness and survival, and the way that in ensuring their own survival, they ensure that the community, so the rodents and the human beings are fed, is very profound in its nature. And nature has no intention either, so this was entirely, this evolutionary process in its unintention almost makes it more holy, you know, because the oaks didn't think, or the pecans didn't think, I'm going to provide this for humans and squirrels. It just happened, and I think that's more holy. All right, now we got the handouts. I love we got handouts here. So this one's kind of a longer quote, but if someone will read the first quote, it says, forest ecologists hypothesize.
I'll read it. Forest ecologists hypothesize that mass pruning is a simple outcome of this energetic equation. Make fruit only when you can afford it. If this were true, each tree would fruit on its own schedule, predictable by the size of its reserves of stored starch. But they don't. If one tree fruits, they all fruit. There are no soloists. No one tree in a grove, but the whole grove. Not one grove in the forest, but every grove, all across the county and all across the state. The trees act not as individuals, but somehow as collective. Exactly how they do this, we do not yet know. But what we see is the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. We can starve together or feast together. All flourishing is mutual. I wanted to say that I lived in about 8,000 feet high in Presto, Colorado, and we had pine nuts trees. And when they had all of their pine nuts all over the ground, the rodents had a bumper year, and all the people from Spanish origin would come up and gather them by the armloads and basket loads. And it was really something to witness.
Any other thoughts on this quote?
In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she relates a story about her grandfather, I believe it was, who was a young boy with his friends, found a pecan tree, and brought home a bunch of pecans. I guess they all did. I think he had time in his pants or something. But that bounty fed their family through that winter.
Yeah, it's the natural flourishing of the forest. This is actually from the same chapter.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's from Braiding Sweetgrass?
Yeah, sorry. I always forget to read the quotes. It's like my downfall. This is from Braiding Sweetgrass. I didn't write this. Yeah, so this is from the chapter where she talks about the mass year, so the biology of how these trees coordinate this masking effort, and also a story about her grandfather who was a teenager on the reservation, and it was sort of a lean year, you know, hunting wasn't good and the crops weren't growing very well. And so him and his brother found this group of pecans during the mass year and filled their pants up with it and ran home with their pants full of pecans. That was a funny story from Braiding Sweetgrass. Alright, this one's a shorter quote. And this one is from Gathering Moss. So, somebody won't mind reading holding water against the cold.
Holding water against the pull of the sun and welcoming it back again is a communal activity. No moss can do it alone. It requires the interweaving of shoots and branches standing together to create a place for water.
To me, this quote, I think, speaks to almost like a Christmas or Easter kind of season, where welcoming back water, I think, can also stand in for moments of great faith and great celebration. So at Easter and at Christmas, as a community, it's much easier to feel that kind of religious presence, that kind of faith, when you have people to celebrate with and people to stand by.
I must be in a somewhat contrary mood today, but I keep thinking of Jesus going off by himself into the wilderness.
Yeah.
John the Baptist, I imagine several of the others, and yet that was where they received the most wisdom. So there's a place for both.
Yeah.
If they hadn't come back, that wisdom would have been lost.
Certainly. I don't know how the importance of isolation plays into the biology here, but I agree.
Well, also, you were talking about the canopy. I couldn't help thinking about until there's a hole in the canopy, those young trees can't mature.
True.
I said, I'm pretty contrary.
Yes, no, that is true. That is true. So it is the balance of the ecosystem that for the most part these trees want to maintain this environment, and then only rarely will one tree fall and make root, but that's sort of a sacrifice that a lot of the other trees around it will make. Whenever you notice a fallen tree, you can always look around and see bark being scraped up, other trees around it, branches falling down as well, because it takes all of that with it. And the wind will rip off all of the weak branches, and the trees will come down. It's definitely something that they try to prevent, but that is necessary almost. It's actually interesting about that is that a lot of times it will happen in the winter, and it's actually almost catastrophic when trees fall in the summertime because they're transporting sugars and waters up their bark, and so the bark is much more tender because of the sugars and waters that are being transported in it. So if they get enough force behind a fallen tree or even a fallen branch, it can take bark off of a tree and essentially skin it, for that part of it and make it very susceptible to fungal infections. So oftentimes you'll go into the woods in the spring, and that's when trees prefer to fall. And so you'll see a bunch of fallen trees. One more quote. This is actually from a chapter about pecans again, but it felt very fitting. Someone wants to read the pecan growers give and give again.
The pecan groves give and give again. Such communal generosity might seem incompatible with the process of evolution, which invokes the imperative of individual survival. But we make a grave error if we try to separate individual well-being from the health of the whole. The gift of abundance from pecans is also a gift to themselves. By sating squirrels and people, the trees are ensuring their own survival.
Kind of a symbiotic relationship then.
Yeah. Or a mutual.
I love this quote. To me, it is the metaphor for being of service, right?
you don't be of service to help yourself, you be of service to help someone else. But you get that tenfold when you do it. So, you know, it's the loaves and fishes thing. The loaves and fishes, we'll have enough if we just give, we will be provided for, and it makes us happy.
Yeah.
Just like it makes a pecan tree happy to serve its world around it.
Yeah. And something I didn't get to incorporate too much is in braiding sweetgrass, and also you see this around the nation where old homesteads are, you oftentimes will see pecan trees or oak trees or beech trees because people would collect the nuts and then not eat all of the nuts in the stored cache or what have you, and then those nuts would actually grow into more trees. So in that way, humans also, by consuming these nuts, ensure that some of them will also grow. In New England, it's not the exact same analogy, but you see it with apple trees in New England specifically, where you can go to these old homesteads, or you can know that an old homestead was in a particular place because of the apple trees, because reliably people care for it and make apple trees survive, just as apples provide for humans. That's all the quotes I have. Unless anyone else has anything else they want to say about this quote. We have to add some reflection questions. So I guess the questions that I want to leave you all with are, where can we find abundance in our lives, like a pecan grove? Or where can we be this abundance to others? And how can we live close to each other to hold water as a communal activity, like mosses do? And then how can we ensure that all our prosperity is mutual? So, as we do our Mass here, how do we make sure that everyone else is also able to do their Mass here, Yeah. So, that's all I got.
I think your presentation this morning, Michael,